China supports the settlement of African issues by Africans in the African way. We are of the view that in resolving security issues, both the symptoms and the root causes must be addressed in a holistic way. China stands ready to take an active part in Africa's efforts in capacity building for maintaining and strengthening peace and security, and support Africa in its endeavors to speed up development, eradicate poverty, and realize durable peace.
Now, China supports the settlement of African issues by Africans in the African way. That was Chinese President Xi Jinping's message during his opening speech at the Johannesburg Summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. But just how ready is Africa to tap into the growing ties between China and Africa? And what challenges still lie ahead for Africa in utilizing that opportunity? Well, this week we unpack Africa's vision and action plans for 2016 against the background of deepening China-Africa cooperation. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, the recently concluded Johannesburg Summit is said to have opened a new chapter in China-Africa relations. Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed a 10-point action plan to help Africa develop. He also pledged $60 billion to help fund these projects. So how much of a game changer will these proposals be? Well, I sat down with the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, to gauge Africa's reaction. Madam Chair, thank you very much for giving me your time. Now, President Xi Jinping announced a 10-point plan for Africa. How would you characterize the significance of that 10-point plan as announced by President Xi?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I just think the overall speech was very good and in line with our own aspirations and our own agenda, Agenda 2063. And that plan, if we all implement it together, is really very important because it's at the center of creating jobs, of modernizing Africa. If you look at the points he raised the issue about agriculture, modernizing agriculture. And as you know, we are not self-sufficient in food. We import billions and billions of food, dollars worth of food. So it's an important area. He talked about infrastructure, the three networks, highways, railways, and aviation. And Africa is a huge continent. If we are to connect this continent and integrate it, it can't be integrated through policy without integrating it physically as well. So, and we already have an MOU on those. So it's in line with our own priorities. He talks about industrialization. Of course, industrialization is what will bring sustainable economic growth into Africa. It's what will bring jobs to the young people that we have. That's what will bring us more revenue because you get more for manufactured goods. He talked about poverty programs to alleviate poverty. Of course, we have to lift our people out of poverty. So it's all in line. He talked about training. And for me, training is very important for a number of reasons. When you have unequal societies, a gap between big gap, the most effective equalizer is training and skills. Secondly, you need skilled people for today's and tomorrow's economy. Thirdly, skilled people will create jobs but they can get jobs as well. But they can innovate, because the future is about innovation. Today, in fact, not the future, today and tomorrow is about innovation. And he also mentioned people-to-people cooperation, cultural exchanges. Of course, to that I would add tourism, because tourism is also a big job creator.
Right.
And also it brings revenue to the country. And it makes people understand and appreciate our continent. So it's a good partnership, because it's not a partnership where you say, I'll give you money for this. But obviously he looked at what we ourselves have defined as our path, and he then linked into that path, taking into account their own experience. So I thought it was a great speech, but also input into our agenda in terms of also giving resources.
The other issue also that China has pledged is $60 billion, though, in development assistance for Africa. In your view, though, how is this going to benefit smaller countries like Niger, like Somalia, and the ordinary African people?
Well, part of that, we can look at it in terms of energy generation. You can look at it in terms of the country developing its infrastructure. So it's going to, I think it will be important for Africa to really use this as a catalyst, these funds as a catalyst to draw other resources, but also to enhance internal capacities. So it's going to benefit, I think, every country, but I think it would be good if it benefits the ones who need it most.
Many are seeing the coming of China and Africa in South Africa, a historic summit here, the first being held on African soil. Many are seeing this as a milestone, as historic, as a new reality in China-Africa ties. Has China-Africa relations now been elevated to a new level?
Yes, as was said, both our chair of the union, President Mugabe, President Zuma, and I'm sure it will be said by many others today. Yes, it has been taken to a new level. If you remember, it's not only just, it's taken to a new level by by the realities of China and the realities of Africa. Because if you remember, 15 years ago when FOCAC started, Africa was in a position where we had lots of debt. We were grappling with how we're going to get into the world economy. And FOCAC came, and there's been a lot of work done. But I think now, with this FOCAC going forward, it's going to build on the foundation that has been laid, but it's going to be scaling the heights, as he put it. We're going to be scaling the heights, looking forward, and this is not a sprint relationship. It's a marathon. We're in for a long haul. It's a long history, but it's also a long future ahead of us. And of course, between the first FOCAC summit and now, from 2000 and now, we've seen the headquarters of Africa,
right.
African Union, is a monument to this relationship as well, because Chinese resources assisted to also build that headquarters. But I think now it's clear that Africa has a lot to offer, China has a lot to offer, so we can really have a win-win cooperation for common development.
Madam Chair, we'll leave it there, but thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you.
Now we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, my expert guests will join me to unpack Africa's opportunities and challenges in the new year. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now we continue our analysis of President Xi Jinping's 10-point plan for Africa. And I have expert guests standing by in Nairobi from the Institute of Diplomacy, Dr. Adam Solow, and in Beijing, current affairs commentator Victor Gao. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining in the conversation. Dr. Adam Solow, I'll start off with you there. President Xi Jinping announced a 10-point program for Africa's development. First, what do you see as the significance of this for Africa?
Well, I think the significance for this for Africa is that for the first time, a country has come up with a comprehensive plan that cuts across what you can call mega projects dealing with infrastructure, industrialization, agriculture, financial investment, and the like, and also addresses what you can call the mundane matters that touch on the ordinary people, such as health, such as people-to-people action plans, such as cultural development, as well as talent development. And therefore, one can now not, if the plan was to work, accuse China of being more concerned with only the ruling elites. But if this plan was to work, then one can say that it is inclusive of both the ruling elite and the masses of Africa.
Right. Victor Gao, your take?
Well, I would say that the development of Africa is mostly the responsibility of the African countries and the African people. However, a big country like China can really offer a lot of help. And I think President Xi Jinping's major speech containing these 10-point proposals indicate that China can actually offer our own track record and our own experience to our African brothers and sisters on an equal footing, so that we can look at Africa as a continent and African countries each being an equal and to be fully respected, and then the development challenges that African countries are faced with, and then drawing on our own experience of pulling China out of poverty in a short period of only 37 years, and share our lessons and experiences with the African countries. The 10 areas that President Xi Jinping has outlined, in my best judgment, exactly reflect the 10 areas that China and African countries cooperate for the mutual benefit.
Do you see Africa making use of FOCAC and making use of that 10-point program to realize the African agenda?
I think I want to agree with Victor that you can get help from outside, but at the end of the day, it is Africans themselves who will have to bring this 10-point plan to realization. I think one has to say that part of the problem in most African countries, not all, has been, for example, corruption. And one wants to look at it that if these investments, if this aid, if these loans and grants are going to come to the respective African countries and the continent at large, is it going to be put into good use, or is it going to end up in the pockets of some ruling elite and correct businessmen? So the vision is there. The realization is something totally different based on the African experience. And I think the other thing that one has to talk about is that Africa looks united when it goes out there to engage with her development partners, including China. But we also know that Africa, both within or between respective states and also within their own territorial boundaries, have a lot of differences,
right,
a lot of polarizations, and therefore the image they give out there when they go to meet China is not the same with what happens internally and between the respective countries.
Right, and of course, Victor Gao, Africa is 54 countries at varying levels of development, dealing with China, you know, in various stages. Where do you see Africa and China's development needs meeting, particularly in relation to the 10-point program?
In my best judgment, one thing comes out in a very prominent manner. That is the infrastructure and the capacity building in Africa. Africa itself is big. It's about 30 million square kilometers. Population is about 1 billion. And I would say that infrastructure is very, very important. Infrastructure in Africa in general is very fragmented, and intra-African connectivity is actually very minimum. I would say Africa probably is the most fragmented continent among all the continents in terms of infrastructure and connectivity. I think China can really help the African countries in looking at Africa as a whole, and coming up with proposals for the major infrastructure corridors, connectivities in terms of highways, railways, airports, seaports, etc., so that efficiency can be greatly enhanced for all the countries in Africa, either coastal countries or, you know, land-bound countries
right,
inside the center of Africa. And in this way, I think African countries can be better positioned to engage in all the 10 points that President Xi Jinping has outlined and really create and increase their productivity and efficiency in industrialization and modernization.
Dr. Olo, and that brings us to the question of the African Union, now a member of FOCAC itself. Though, how do you see this aligning with the African Union's agenda of 2063? And what do you think that the African Union's role is going to be moving forward?
Well, basically, as you correctly say, the African Union has come with Agenda 2063, which is basically a 50-year vision in terms of how she wants to go, that is benchmarked on 10-year programs with aspirations of sustainable development, inclusive growth, and the like. I think that the challenge is that when you look at Africa, if you leave the infrastructure that Victor has talked about, then you'll find that there is a lot of fragmentation also politically as well as economically. For example, you look at the African Union at the apex from a continental basis, but you also have regional economic communities right there, East African Community, South African Development Community, the Maghreb Union, and the ECOWAS. And at times you find that such regional economic communities are not speaking the same voice. The question is, can African Union blur these differences both at the regional level as well as at the national level, so that the African Union becomes the centerpiece upon which all the 54 African states move with one voice? The other issue, of course, is as to how China is going to go ahead, and maybe I might want to hear Victor's comment on this, because when it comes to peace and security, then you'll always find that the African Union takes the lead role. But when it comes to economic and social as well as political issues, then you find that it's either the regional communities or the particular sovereign states. And we know that during the recent FOCAC, China was very clear that it already has some pilot programs within the East African region. And basically, my understanding is that such pilot programs have been at the initiative of China and the respective bilateral countries. And
Right.
it's not necessarily the African Union that chose where to begin the pilot programs. And therefore, the challenge is there an organizational infrastructure through which China and the AU are going to proceed going forward without raising the normal sibling rivalry from African countries.
Right. What's the way forward here? What's the look ahead, though, in that relationship, though, Victor? Is it bilaterally with individual countries or through the African Union?
Well, I would say from the Chinese perspective, China needs to engage with Africa in a multiple way. Engaging fully with African Union is important, especially because African Union is mostly a political union rather than an economic or commercial or trade union. On the other hand, I would say engaging with each of the 54 African countries is very important for China, because most of the trade and industrial projects, etc., need to be settled down in one or the other country on the African continent. However, I would say if China can work together with the African countries to come up with regional clusters, just now mentioned by the professor, and also especially focusing on the regional transportation hubs or connectivity projects, etc., then you need to look at Africa in different parts: the Eastern African, Western African, North African, for example, Southern Africa, and Central Africa. In this way, I think different kinds of projects can be worked upon and completed in a more efficient manner.
Dr. Olodo, the co-chair, President Zuma, listed 4 priority areas for Africa. He did list industrialization, infrastructure, agriculture, and health as the 4 priorities for Africa. Where should Africa be putting their emphasis?
Well, I think that for me, everything should start with infrastructure, because in that infrastructure, if you look at the priorities of Jacob Zuma, he's talking of industries and he's also talking of agriculture. If we go to basic economics in terms of factors of production, which is basically capital, land, and labor, then you find that we are now talking of agricultural modernization, and we're also talking of industrialization, which means we are trying to move away from the old adage that bedeviled Africa, that you are either largely an agricultural producer or you are an industrial producer. And we are basically saying, Zuma is saying, that we want to have a mix of both industries and agricultural modernization going hand in hand. And for me, the key driver of that is to have the infrastructure, as Victor had said earlier on, because this will bring interconnectivity and spur economic growth and also technological advancement.
Victor, though, China laid emphasis on 3 of the bottlenecks that they said were hindering Africa's development, and that was lack of infrastructure, skilled personnel, and funding to encourage industrial connection and what you called productivity there. Where else should we be looking at?
Well, I would say that Africa in general is very, very rich in natural resources, but also in human resources. On the other hand, for example, in talking about agricultural produce from Africa, it's very low and efficiency is very low. Therefore, I would say, if we draw upon the track record of the late Chinese paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, I would say we need to come up with new paradigms, new thinking, and new ways of doing things, new business models for Africa. Now, we have a very famous Chinese agricultural scientist, Professor Yuan Longping, who said that if his hybrid rice can be popularized in Africa, Africa can produce much more than the African people would need. And there will be a lot of rice export out of Africa to other continents. This means that if African countries can really think hard and draw experiences from, let's say, China's experience or other major countries' experiences and come up with a very unique set of skills and business models suited to the African circumstances, then the upsiding Africa for each of the African countries, for the different parts of Africa, and for the African continent as a whole will be very, very high.
Well, let's briefly now look ahead to 2016 as we wind down on 2015. Dr. Olo, looking ahead though, what is in store for China and Africa strategies and cooperation, and what do you see as being in store for Africa generally?
What I see as in store for China and Africa is that ever since FOCAC was initiated, we have seen a lot of leaps, especially from the China part in terms of where they want Africa to go. I think for Africa, at the moment, there's still the usual begging with the bowl, and therefore we have yet to see a vision and an action plan that is brought to realization. If you go down the memory lane, we've had so many visions from the Lagos plan to, of late, NEPAD and the African Union Constitutive Act, and now Agenda 63. So Africa is not short of coming up with vision. What Africa is short of is implementation and having a result orientation and a monitoring and evaluation of making sure that the very, very able visions that are always brought about see the light of the day.
Well, Dr. Olo, though, on that note, then how do you think Africa should tap into the China potential and or its friendship with China to enhance that side of the coin?
I would only say one word: partnership. And it should be a partnership of learning.
Right. Victor Gao?
Definitely a partnership, camaraderie in a sense, and we are really, comrades in arms together. And I think a full respect of each other and no lecturing by one side to the other side. And I want to emphasize again, no conditionality in whatever China need to do with the African countries, because otherwise it really spoils the whole environment, the whole atmosphere. If China and African countries cannot respect with each other, treat each other as equals, and look at each other as brothers and sisters, then eventually the foundation of this partnership between China and Africa will be eroded. And I think, whether China was a developing country, whether China is the largest economy by purchasing power parity measurement, or the second largest economy by official exchange rate measurement, China wants to be fully committed to work with the Africans as brothers and sisters on equal footing. This will be the guiding principle for 2016 as well as for many years going forward. I'm personally very much excited, and I really look forward to visiting many African countries in the coming years to really fully engage with our African brothers and sisters working together.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. And that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Nairobi, from the Institute of Diplomacy, Dr. Adam Solo, and in Beijing, current affairs commentator Victor Gao. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And thank you for watching Talk Africa this week. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.